Good evening and welcome. Thank you for joining us on this virtual information session on the Planning Unit Data Review in preparation for the fall boundary adjustments for middle and high schools, as well as Abingdon and Drew elementary schools, which are slated to take place this fall. This meeting is scheduled from 7 to 8:30 p.m. and we do appreciate you taking the time to engage with us, learn about this process. Know that we're going to honor your commitment by starting and ending on time. Before we jump in, I'd like to go through a couple of housekeeping items. Throughout the presentation, we're going to ask that you submit your questions and comments in the Q&A box, and we will address those at the end of the presentation. Another great thing about the Q&A that you submit is that it's going to help us with compiling the frequently asked questions that are going to be posted online for this process. If some questions require more exploration and we cannot provide an answer to you, especially when it's around data, and we do have to do some research on that, it will surely become a part of our FAQs, and those will be posted online. A recording of this presentation will be available and posted online. The direct link to the process page is listed below at the very bottom, but if you just visit apsva.us/engage and under the current initiatives section, just click on K-12 Planning Unit Data Review, and then you'll find the page there. So with us tonight, we have Planning and Evaluation staff. We have Lisa Stengel, our Executive Director. We have Jonathan Teresi, our Director of Strategic Planning, Robert Ruiz, our Principal Planner, and I am Gladys Bourdoin, and I'm an Integrated Project Planner. So we will either present the information or answer the questions, and also we are monitoring the questions and comments that we review, and so one of us is also doing that. For tonight's agenda, during this virtual session, we will share the goal of this data review. We're going to go through the timeline, through December. We're going to go through the tools and the resources that are available for your review to be able to provide staff with your input specific to a planning unit. And of course, we're going to answer your questions. For the meeting objective, what we want is that we want to introduce the process, including the required informational resources, which includes the data table and then the tools to community members that are interested in reviewing and providing input to staff on the available data. And we're also going to share how your input will be used in this process. So that is what we want the takeaway to be for tonight. This process is about making the data by planning unit available to the community to review, to understand, to ask questions on, and provide any input for staff review. This provides time for staff to address questions related to projections, questions, which include factors specific to housing development questions or comments, walk zone data, whether a planning unit was involved in a previous boundary process, student demographics information. So all of those data points we make available to you because that is the data that we are going to use during the adjustment process in the fall. We're going to go into the questionnaire momentarily in the next slides, but it's really important to mention that the questionnaire is structured in a way for staff to categorize your input so that we may be able to review and analyze it and conduct further research if necessary and make any adjustments to the data so that we may be able to post a final data table by August 2021. The boundary process now extends over a longer period of time. Stage 1 is what we call this planning unit data review, which happens now in the spring. And then stage 2 is the boundary adjustments that are going to happen in the fall. By separating this review stage and making the data that we'll be using for boundary adjustments available allows for the input from the community about the data to be addressed now, before any scenarios are created. The early review of the data with the community allows more time to make those any needed adjustments to the data, those discussions to take place, that research and exploration to take place. And then the boundary adjustment process can be more focused, specific to that input on scenarios, for example. But how, just so you know, the community input is being gathered in both processes, and that is the big win in separating the two. One of the things we want to share is how community input was used from last data review process. And as you remember, last year was the first time where we separated the two processes, and it was very successful and effective. After reviewing community input that we received last year, we added an extra year to the planning unit projections, which included 2024. We worked with Arlington County government staff to review and verify the questions, the input that we received, and make adjustments to the data on the housing developments if necessary. That were necessary. We corrected a new housing development classification from multifamily elevator to multifamily garden. We corrected the year forecasted for a new residential development's completion from 2021 to 2020, which meant accounting for these students a year earlier than expected. And of course, we provided FAQs and additional resources as background information, and again, a further understanding as we go through these processes together. What we're asking the community to do is to review the planning unit data using your knowledge of your neighborhoods. And I'm sure many of you know, but the planning units are those geographic building blocks that we use to define those attendance boundaries for us to be able to build scenarios, for example, for neighborhood schools. And we ask that you please provide input to staff about any data points that need attention by completing the online questionnaire. That is, we ask for you to please go to the questionnaire. In the questionnaire, you'll find that we ask for your email address as well in case we need to get back to you if we have any questions on the input that you have provided. And then you have through June 20th to do that for us. If you would please help us in spreading the word for that. So what I'll do now is I'm actually going to go through our webpage, our process webpage, where you can find all of this information, and I'll go through it as well as my colleagues. I'm going to ask Robert to also help me go through some of it. Let me start, just so you know, when I go through these, you might see some pauses while I share one window to another window. So you might experience a few pauses, so I apologize for that. But just bear with us, please. Thank you. Thank you, I'm almost there. Oh, I'm sharing it already. Awesome. So this is our webpage, the K-12 Planning Unit Data Review in preparation for the Fall 2020 boundary adjustments, and you can get it right here under Engage from Current Initiatives. Once you land on that page, the first thing that I put up here in red is the Community Online Information Session, and then that link. But normally, if we don't have a meeting going on, this is the first thing you'll see. And of course, the Community Questionnaire is right here on this link. I'm going to go through the planning unit data table, which I already have open. Let me just make sure I'm sharing it. And I'm not, so let me try this again. Here we go. So this is the planning unit data table. One of the important things that we ask is to please, the notes, the footnotes, actually, it's the very first thing that we list. And for some reason, I can't share it in the same way unless I unfreeze the panes. So what you'll see here are the planning units, all of the 347 planning units. You're also going to see the projections through September 2024 for neighborhood school students. The percentage of, in this case, actually, one of the most important things I'm going to show you that we have different tabs. So here we have the high school tab. So these are going to be projections, for example, specific. They're going to be specific to grades 9 to 12. The projections will be the percentage of high school students who attended their neighborhood school in 2019-20 and 2021. You're going to see the neighborhood high schools, the neighborhood high school for 2021. Also for previous years, 2016-17. Also the neighborhood middle school for 21-22, the neighborhood middle school for previous since previous boundary processes were made, as well as the neighborhood elementary school. So one great thing about that is that you can see the progression for the planning unit of what has happened. Of course, you're going to see whether there's a new housing development that you'll be able to see in table 2 that we'll go through in a little bit. There's a yes or no, so you'll be able to see yes, we do have a new housing development. You'll be able to go to table 2 to verify that that is what you see in your planning unit. You're going to see any forecast of committed affordable housing units through 2024, any existing committed affordable units. We do list the civic association name. It's as an informational item purposes only. We do list the walk zone information. We do work with our facilities and operations department for those, and these are the walk zones for 21-22. Of course, that doesn't include any expanded walk zones that were expanded due to COVID, because we don't know what's going to happen with those. But right now, this is the most available data that we have, which are walk zones for 21-22. And then, of course, we provide demographics information, including economically disadvantaged or English language learners, students with disabilities, and then information by race of students. And then just for filtering purposes, we have these fields. Did the neighborhood elementary school or middle school or high school change? And so this is a simple yes or no, and you can just easily filter that information. So this is actually the data table where you can look through it, ask questions, ask us any information, or if you want to verify any information that's there or have any questions on it. Robert, is there something on the data table that you would like to expand upon?
Thank you, Gladys. Yeah, just the only thing is just to emphasize that there are projections, and those are, that's information about, what we think the outlook is for students in the future that we estimate will be attending a neighborhood school, but also note those columns like F and G and other columns that are that sort of khaki colored. That refers to demographic information of students that were actually in APS in 2019 or 2020. So, there's information about a forward outlook, but also where we've been in 2019 and 2020. That's all. Thank you.
Excellent, Robert. And as I started to say, is that for these tabs, this is the high school tab. We understand that some families may only be interested in looking at the high school information for their planning unit. However, we do provide all of the information for middle school, as well as for Abingdon and Drew planning units only. So you are welcome to, you have access to this information. Now I'm going to go to table 2. I'm going to make sure that I'm sharing it. Yep, I am. Actually not. Okay, now I am. And here I'm actually going to ask Robert to help me introduce table 2 and how to use it.
Thank you, Gladys. Yes, so there's we can go through the different fields and the different columns, and I'll just go briefly on what data they represent. So on column A, the forecast year of completion, that is the year at which Arlington County government has estimated that different residential projects will be completed and become habitable. One thing that you will see is many projects that are year 2020, and oftentimes they'll have, for example, 1 unit. What those represent is a new practice for this planning unit projections, different from prior years, is that we requested from the county all the building permits for single-family detached homes and townhomes in the county. And we assumed that all those would have been built in the school year for 2020-21. Even though we don't publish projections for 2020 in our table, that data does inform and have an effect and has an effect on 2021. So for full transparency, we include that information. The next field is the development name. Most of the times you'll see development names for large projects, usually large commercial residential projects such as apartment buildings, or non-commercial residential such as large condo buildings that the county for their own approval processes will assign them a name. Usually the name given by the developer for the project. So that's what we call the development name. And again, that's also information that we get from Arlington County government. The next field on column C is the address. And so that's the address of the project. One thing to note is that those addresses could change over time. For example, what the county knows the address for a project is today. By the time the project is finished, and the entrance and exits are actually constructed, a new address might be issued for the building. So just bear that in mind. And so the next field in column D is the affordability classification of new development. So when you see something that's called market rate, that means that building is not receiving any affordability subsidy, or the tenants or are not receiving any subsidy in terms of the rent that they pay. In some cases, we will call a building mixed income, and those are instances where the building, it's a mixture of market rate, again, no subsidy to those tenants, and then other cases where there are tenants that receive subsidies or below market rents. And then another category that we have is committed affordable units, known as CAVs. And those are instances where the tenant is paying below market rent or there is a subsidy. And we have a definition for that in the methodology, as well as I believe in this table.
Yep.
And then the next column, that would be, believe that's F, net new units. That's the number of units that are expected and that we used for the projection purposes. But the reason why we have the word net there is that, for example, hypothetically, imagine if there's a 4-unit building And that building is demolished, and a 200-unit building is built in its place. In that case, the net gain in units would be 196, and so that's what it's that net difference, it's that net gain that we use for the calculations of students. The theory being that for those 4 units, if there had been students, we would have been counting them in some of our data that we use to start off the projections. And I'll get into a little bit of that later. And then this is one title, Gladys, that I just caught this. We need to change the title of G, and that should not be elementary students, that should just be estimate of students from new housing. And so what that number represents is the K-12 students that are estimated to come from those net new units. And I'll get and I'll explain in the presentation a little later how that number is, how we derive that number. And then the last field, H, planning unit, that's the planning unit number that building can be found at. So that's one way for the community as they're thinking, gee, I wonder if that building down the street in my planning unit, is that in the data set? That's where that's how you could cross-reference. One thing to note though is if you go to the next tab, so this is the second tab or table 3, the county, Arlington County is a very desirable place to live in, and as such, developers and others are always looking to build new housing. And so the Arlington County government, almost on a monthly basis will be considering projects for approval for X number of units. The thing to note is that not every project that is approved is likely to be built from the years 2021 to 2024. And so this table number 3 includes all the projects that were approved by the Arlington County Board since July 1, 2020. From October 1, 2020 to May 17, 2021. So the projects that you saw in the first tab or table 2 include many approved projects. But again, not all approved projects will be built in that time period from 2021 to 2024. Only a subset of them are, and so those are the ones that make it onto that table 2. In this case, on table 3, you get projects that were approved, and the number of units is now more firm than perhaps it was prior to its approval. But in the housing forecast, that won't be updated until September 30th of this year. But this we provide just so that the community understands that, yes, we understand that there are projects that have been approved since the data that we got from the county for the housing forecast. So we do acknowledge that, but the caveat being such as that Crystal Plaza East Tower at 2001 South Bell Street, that project won't be considered for a housing forecast by the county until the fall of this year, so later this year. So just a way of acknowledging what the county has approved, but at the same time, the caveat being is some of those projects until the county has an estimate for its construction date when it will be finished, we cannot include it in the projections. But if the community, for example, might have updated information. For example, that project, it's actually breaking ground. They're actually digging the earth and it looks like construction is starting. That's the type of information that we're interested in knowing, because it could be that the county might at the time that they provided us this data might not have been aware of some of those facts. And in the construction field, things can change very quickly. And so that's one thing to consider. So in this table, column A is the quarter and the year that the project was formally approved. Column B is the site plan number. And so that we provide that only so that in case you're interested about learning more about the project, you can go to the county's website and they do have pages on all their different site plans that have been approved, and you can look at the site plan report, etc. The site address is one of the addresses for the site plan project that the county provided us. Column D is the residential units approved, and that's just, it's not net new, it's just the number of units that were approved. And again, we rely on the county to provide us with that net difference. For this data, they have not provided that. And then the last field, column E, housing forecast year. So sometimes the county will provide us, will include some of these projects prior to their formal adoption by the county board. They will provide it to us in the housing forecast, but at the time of the housing forecast, they might not have, for example, the number of units for the project might be changing based on different factors and community input related to those projects. So the number of the reason why this is important to note is that for some of these projects, like for example, Crystal Plaza West Tower, that project was included in the housing forecast for 2023, but at the time that it was included in the housing forecast, that number of units that were approved was different than what ended up being approved of 338. So the one asterisk that you'll note there is that we will go back and actually, once we update the planning unit projections, we'll now include, we'll work with the county to include this new number of formally, officially approved number of units. So again, the construction is a little bit complicated in terms of the timing, etc. But we do work, we keep track of these formal approvals so that we can update our information. Thank you, Gladys.
Thank you, Robert. And I know that this is going to be extremely helpful for our community, for them to be able to understand and then provide that input. Again, thank you. As I pause here, as I go through some of these. The last one that I wanted to show you is the planning unit map. And this is the planning unit reference map. Just want to make sure that you're seeing that. Yep. And this one is a quick one for those of us who can read maps. If not, you can always go to our boundary attendance area locator. I'll see if I can show you real quick. Just plug in your address and it shows you what planning unit you belong to. But basically, you can really zoom in here, locate exactly where your home is, and then if it's within, for example, this shaded area, that's how we distinguish from one to the other. Not only do we put the planning unit numbers, but you can distinguish because of the color difference adjacent to one another. So if your home is within the boundaries of this tan color, for example, then you belong to 15910, for example. And that's your planning unit. Let's see. Planning and the methodology. So another thing that we have available for you is a methodology document. Let's see, I'm going to show it to you from here because I'm already here. Oh. And then you can really see how to get this information. And the methodology document is right here. And that goes through the data sources, planning unit projections, assumptions, and the methodology. Goes through elementary projections and middle school projections and the high school projections. Forecasted enrollment. And really, if you have the opportunity to review this, you'll really have a full understanding of the planning unit projections and that methodology behind it. I know that Robert is going to go through some of the information in some of the slides. We've created some slides for you. But Robert, is there anything else that you want to say around this document that you may not go through in the slides?
Just, I mean, the only thing you might want to keep in mind is if there's some term like committed affordable that you're interested in learning more about, this document does have, definitions for a lot of the terms that for data that it goes into the projection. So it's worth just for understanding what some of the data that's used and maybe some of those terms that most people are not familiar with, like CAFs, but the definition would be here.
Thank you. All right. Just bear with me a moment. Okay. Robert, we are at planning unit projections overview. Just want to make sure that that's what I'm showing you.
Thank you. So for the planning unit projections, the planning unit projections are a special projection that we do, and its use is exclusively for instances where there's boundary adjustments. We produced this in planning unit projection in early 2021. And because the boundary adjustments is for neighborhood schools, neighborhood attendance zones, the projections are, work to do estimates on future students that we estimate will attend a neighborhood school. And so again, the use for these projections is only for when there's boundary adjustments that need to happen, and so there needs to be estimates on the number of students that are impacted by different scenarios. How many future students there will be in different boundary scenarios. But for other instances that we get asked about, for example, the capital improvement plan, the CIP, or data that informs budgeting, or data related to capacity utilization. For those, we have another data source of projections, which is the annual fall projections. Usually 10 years. This past fall 2020 it was for 3 years, but those are the projections that really should be informing things like the capital improvement plan, budgeting, capacity utilization. That's their intended use. But again, for planning units, it's those boundary adjustments. These planning unit projections were calculated separately from and use a different methodology than the fall 2020 3-year projections. And the reason this is important to note is that because the enrollment projections won't necessarily match. Part of this is due to the fact that they are using different methodologies. So even though in some cases some of the same data might be used, it's being treated differently. At the same time, the size of the samples that we use to create those projections are different. For the fall projections, we use whole school attendance zones as the basis for projecting going forward. But at the planning unit level, you're using very small units of analysis, and so you're picking up a different number of students. So again, different methodologies will yield different results. And then the other thing to note is that the planning unit projections, again, as I mentioned earlier, the intended use is for boundary adjustments for neighborhood schools. And so the projections are concerned with projecting students estimated to attend a neighborhood school, whereas our fall projections include all APS students, both students who attend neighborhood schools and students who attend option schools and programs. The planning unit enrollment projections are for fall 2021 through fall 2024, and include projected K-5 enrollment for Abingdon and Dr. Charles R. Drew Elementary units. And for at the middle school level and at high school level, we do include all planning units. Next slide, please. The planning unit's projections use September 30, 2019 official enrollment count from the student information system, which is matched to planning units and was used as a base for the projections. Ordinarily, with these projections, we would use the latest enrollment information, which when we worked on these projections this spring would have been September 30th, 2020, but we did not use these, and this was in keeping with what we also did in the fall projections. As many of you might know, between 2019 and 2020, there was a fall in a decline in the number of students at APS. And that's a trend that we did not want to reflect strongly going into the future. And so that's one of the reasons why we decided to use September 30th, 2019 as the base or the starting point for projections. So we used those students as the starting point and project going forward. But do note that we did include the trends from 2019 to 2020. We did want to acknowledge them, but they're included in different forms in the enrollment projections, and that's explained in the methodology. So next slide, please. So one of the questions that we're expecting to get asked about is related to housing, future housing, and how do we estimate the number of students that come from that future housing. So we did want to take a couple slides to just explain how we estimate the number of future APS students from new housing. So to begin with, Arlington County government provides APS with a housing unit forecast. The latest version is from September 30th, 2020. Again, the county and their planning department plays a very important role in the approval and the regulation of residential construction in the county. So if any entity within Arlington County government knows, has a better sense of construction, it would be them. So that's why we rely on our Arlington County government's planning department to furnish us with that housing unit forecast information. So APS uses that housing unit forecast to estimate the number of students from future residential projects. And we base this estimate of future students based on the characteristics of those future housing units as provided by the county. So, the one thing that's important is the location. So we get information on the location of the project, the affordability level, because different affordability levels impact on average how many students are generated by different types of projects. The number of units, obviously, and in that case, as I explained earlier, we use the net new, and the housing type. So based on the forecasted housing units characteristics, APS applies the student generation rate factor to estimate the number of students that might reside in the residential project. And just for background, that student generation rate that we use is based on actual students and actual residential units in the county. For the fall projections and for the planning unit projections, we use the 2019 student generation rates with some minor modifications, but those rates would have different student generation rates for different types of units by different locations in the county, for elementary, for middle and high school. And they take into account things like the housing type. Is it a high-rise with an elevator? Is it a garden apartment? And again, affordability level. So that's all based on actual known information. Next slide, please. So, I kind of gave an overview, slightly abstract, but let's look at an actual example. So one example would be a project that was recently approved, and it will be in that data table 2 that we looked at a little bit earlier, and that would be the Key Bridge Marriott at 1401 Lee Highway. Again, looking at the characteristics for the building, it has 451 market rate units, so it has no committed affordable units. So those units will be completely, what's charged for rent is dictated by the market. It's a multifamily elevator building, so it's going to be a mid-rise to high-rise building. Arlington County government provided APS with an estimate of when they think it'll be finished and have occupants, and that's in 2022 is their latest estimate. So based on the development's location, it will impact Taylor Elementary, Dorothy Ham Middle School, and New Yorktown High School. And one quick way of knowing where any of what areas of the county a project could impact is to go to the registration page at the APS website and look for the boundary locator. So that URL is included here in blue. So try it out and you'll see planning unit information as well. So based on the student generation rate table, and we put a link to the 2023 year enrollment projections report, and noted that you'll find that in attachment C. In attachment C is where you'll find the student generation rate table. So based on that table, the relevant factors or the number of the student generation rates are, for this type of project at the elementary level, it would be around 0.037 students per unit on average. For middle school, it'll be 0.009 students per unit on average. And for high school is 0.010 students per unit on average. And again, this will vary based on location in the county, affordability level, and type of unit. Is it a single family detached home or high rise, mid, or garden? So yeah. Next slide, please. So on this slide, you get a visual of where the Key Marriott site is, in Roslyn. So based on the student generation rate table, again, the relevant factors are there, and then applying those factors. So in that case, it's a matter of applying the number of units, and again, we know it's 451 units. So it'd be 451 times 0.037 student generation rate. That's at the elementary level. So that would generate around 16.687 students. At the middle school, when you apply that factor of 0.009, that would be around 4.059. At the high school level, it'd be 4.510. And the reason why we're showing 3 digits past the decimal point was just to show that, how we apply those rates, which are also, 3 digits past the decimal point. So the total number of students, if you do the math in the calculator or Excel, is 25.256. But on the data table number 2, you'll see that we published 25.3, and that's because for that purpose, we just use the 10th digit for reporting purposes. So those are the number of total K-12 students estimated for the Key Bridge Marriott project. The other thing to note, and this is explained in the methodology document, is that for market rate buildings, we assume that the occupancy will occur over 2 years. So in the enrollment projection sheet, for example, you might see that a lesser number for 2022 than the numbers that we're showing in the slide. But by 23, you'll see that the full impact is felt, because by that point it would have been 2 years. And just, since I'm on the topic, I'll just mention that for projects that, for example, are single family detached homes, or projects that are 100% committed affordable, we assume that the students will take residency the very first year that project is developed and open. So we don't use that 2-year occupancy factor.
Right.
Gladys, I think you have the next slide.
I do. Well, now you are ready to continue to provide us that input. This is really important to us, and I know that there are many of you in our community who are very interested and do provide us with that great input. As of this morning, we have received 50 responses, input by planning unit, and of course it has been on housing development data, student yields from developments, questions around WOG zones, which we work with facilities and operations on, comments related to boundary adjustments by planning unit. And again, I have to stress that the questionnaire is structured in a way for staff to categorize your input, review and analyze it, conduct further research, and make any adjustments to any data points received if necessary. We appreciate the input. We find it extremely helpful in our work. And all the input received will be posted online, and the final data table will be posted online with a summary of any adjustments made. And just so you know, adjustments are being made based on your input, which we will post all of that input, but it's also made by us. Just, by us reviewing this information with you also allows us to edit anything that needs to be fixed on labels, for example, any misspellings, things like that, WOG zones, just to make sure that we have all of the information available. And we thank you in this input so that we can have a final data table in August. I just wanted to quickly go, because we do want to get through some questions, the engagement schedule. This we did share this at the monitoring report, which is also found on our webpage. Right now, we are in the planning unit data review stage that is through June 20th. We will do additional work during the summer internally and post the final data table that will be used for boundary adjustments in August of 2021. As far as the engagement schedule, we will also have an engagement schedule posted around August for Abingdon to Drew boundary refinements. And for middle and high school boundary refinements, we will do that engagement process in October of 2021. And the school board deliberations and actions are on that last column. For Abingdon and Drew, it would be sometime mid-October to early November, and for middle and high school boundary refinements, it would be late November to early December. Of course, we have provided the information of where to find this information if we are with us. I know that you have found this information, but please always go, and this is where we post all of the information that we have available. You can also write to us at engage@apsva.us. But please do use that questionnaire to provide us with input. And now I'm going to ask Jonathan to, well, actually, I'm going to go through the questions that I know that Jonathan has been monitoring the Q&A. So thank you, Jonathan, for that. But let me go through some questions here. Thank you. So the first one, and just so that you don't look at a blank screen. I'm just going to go ahead and, oh. Well, let's see. Okay, my camera had to be on. Hello, everybody. So the first question is, what is a planning unit? And so a planning unit is a way for us to geographically assign students to schools where a group of residences comprise a particular planning unit so that we may be able to create scenarios by using them as building blocks to assign a planning unit to a particular neighborhood attendance zone. And the planning units range in population depending on how many students actually live in a particular planning unit. Robert, I don't know if you want to add anything more to that.
No.
Okay. And how many planning units are there in APS? 347 planning units. It has not changed from year to year. The planning units have been 347. I know that we did, there was a time in 2016-17 where, in 2016-17 where there was a study made, and I think there were changes and they were subdivided. But right now that is our number. Robert, I'm gonna ask for you to give some of these responses. Why does the data in the table only go to 2024? Why not look at the data through 2025 or 2026?
The recent, so just for background, because of the changes that occurred between 2019 and 2020 in our enrollment and that decline in enrollment, and uncertainty whether we wanted to keep that trend from 2019 to 2020 going into the future, we decided in consultation with a consultant who assists us with the planning unit projections to be conservative and not project into the future too far when, since we're going through this period of that 2019 to 2020 trend that's uncertain whether it will continue or not. And so we tried to err on the side of being conservative. So we, for the fall projections, we only went to 2023. We did make an exception for these planning unit projections to go up to 2024, since we had set a precedent last year by doing that. But again, that it's an extra year that we provided. If we went out to 2025, one of the issues is, because we're using 2019 as our base or starting point, when you think about that 2019 kindergartner, by 2025, that 2019 kindergartner will be in 6th grade in 2025. So that means that all your kindergartner to grade 5 projecting students are all based on assumptions on the number of kindergartners that will be at every planning unit, assumptions that it's one tool that we use is cohort transition rates. Again, it's in the report what it is and how we use it, but an assumption that those trends will continue without disruption for all those future years. So again, just to be conservative, we ended it at 2024, but even at 2024, at the kindergarten level, there's just one cohort that is based off of students that were actually in the APS system in 2024. So again, if I were to sum it up in one answer, it would be to be err on the side of being conservative.
Thank you, Robert. Will planning unit projections data be updated in the fall using September 30th, 2021 enrollment?
So one thing that we will do is compare the September 30th, 2020 enrollment with the projections that will be vetted. The projections produced this spring that are being vetted by the community. We will compare those and perhaps make adjustments based on any notable or outsized change in trend from what we projected versus the number of students in the fall.
Thank you, Robert. This is because I have you up, and we have already gone through this information. Where does your housing information come from?
Again, that comes from Arlington County government. And again, the reason we rely on them is the Arlington County's board approves every site plan project, which makes a good portion of the projects that are in our housing forecast. And the Office of Community Planning, Housing and Development, the planning office, plays a very important role in shepherding these projects along to approval and making sure that they meet regulations. So if anyone in the county is aware of the project characteristics and when is it likely to be completed, it'll be the county. So that's why we rely on them for that information.
Great, thank you. Lisa, I have a couple of questions for you. Oh, great, thank you. How will you use the community's input from the questionnaire that identifies some differences in the reported development projects?
Gladys, you probably know this better than anybody. After last year, when we get that information back from individuals, we go and compare. When we have a planning unit or a housing development in a planning unit, we actually go and do a bit of an investigation to see, okay, what is the feedback that it is? Does the feedback show us something different than what's in the county's database? If it does, there's some resolution that's actually done with the county to make sure that what we have for information gets updated and applied as we rerun this data with the corrected information. So you went line by line last year, and I think you made, I can't even remember how many changes you made, but it was a significant number of changes, and they were little ones that people may not notice unless they know those planning units closely, but they really do impact the projected enrollment in those planning units.
They do, and I have to reiterate.
I'll give an example. Yeah, that one, that the housing unit that was that Mr. Lutner gave us. If you want to give that example, I think that's a good one to talk about. That had the wrong student generation rate on it because it was a low rise versus a high rise.
That's exactly what it was. Robert, do you remember exactly the name of the residential development?
I don't remember the exact name, but it was in Rossland, and what occurred is the county, there's thousands of individual parcels and buildings in the county. So in this one instance, unfortunately, they misclassified one building. I can't remember which was which, but it was a misclassification between a high-rise and a garden that was committed affordable. And so it did change the rates because it turned out that in the existing, not 2021-22, but the existing Arlington Science Focus boundary, I don't believe there is a single multifamily elevator committed affordable unit. So that the fact that the county had mistakenly classified that building as such meant that there was a rate for that type of structure, and that rippled through how many students we would estimate for any future project of that kind. So that was a good catch.
Yes. Thank you, Lisa. I'm going to put you back up. But yes, we just want to reiterate just how important, how useful this information is, and that's because you know your neighborhood's best. You can look out your window and see these things going on as they happen. So we're really thankful for that. Thank you, Lisa and Robert. Lisa, will planning unit splits be considered?
Planning unit splits may be considered, but not in time for this boundary process. We don't want to have to apply splits at a point in time when the data can no longer be accounted for. We will consider doing that either next year between the time the school board adopts new boundaries and before we do the planning unit data review next spring for the following year's elementary processes. We'll probably touch base with FAC, the Facilities Advisory Committee, this fall to look at some standard ways of evaluating planning units to see if any of them need to be reevaluated based on some considerations that we would apply consistently across all. And if there's a sizable enough number that needs to be done, we will do that work so that it doesn't fall in the middle of a boundary process or when the data is being reviewed.
Thank you.
So when we can get to it, we will.
Yeah. So there are some questions here. How many people have completed the questionnaire so far? And what efforts are we making to get the community participation on the questionnaire? So far, we have 50 participants who have provided input, as I said, related to all of the categories that we're looking for: housing developments, walk zone, the boundary adjustments for next year, any input that they have on that they want to share with us. And we shared this information in the monitoring report and are working as we do with all of our processes with our bilingual resource assistants to make sure that folks who are interested in diving into the data are able to do so. Working also with our community groups, our established community groups, a lot of them in different languages. They gather because they have the affinity of the languages that they speak, and we work with them for them to know that the process is going on and for them to understand the process, what we're asking for, and to provide us any input, review the data and provide us any input. As you can see, based on how technical it is, we open it to those, we give that opportunity to those who want to provide very in-depth input related to the data, that time to do it now. So it is specific to those who want to dive into the data, and we're thankful for that. And we want everybody who is able to do that to do so. Other ways for community to provide feedback or ask questions about the planning unit data. Yes, we also have already received questions to engage at apsva.us. And we're monitoring that. And we ask that you use the questionnaire to ask questions as well. We're going to post all of that information. So it's just really helpful even for others to know what questions are being asked. But we do also have questions on Engage that we have to answer to. So engage at apsva.us is where you can go and get that information, please. Okay, I actually have Robert, if you're ready for me, I have a couple of questions for you here. If you're ready, if you turn on your video. Thank you. Are student generation rates updated annually? How are they calculated for different? Well, you really went through this, and I would ask folks to go, but are student generation rates updated annually?
So we've been using student generation rates since about 2017, and since then they've been updated annually. But again, because of the unusual circumstances related to fall 2020 enrollment and that decline in enrollment, we didn't do fall 2020 student generation rates. Instead, we relied on a modified version of the 2019 student generation rates. And it's modified because it actually did correct for that classification concern in the Rosslyn area, and so that impacted the rates for garden committed affordable and multifamily elevator committed affordable. But in 2019 is the only time that we used the rates for a given year twice, and that's what we used in the planning unit projections.
Thank you, Robert. Again, you have gone through this, the questions here that we're getting. I'm not sure if they came in before or after the presentation, but thank you folks for tuning in. There is a lot of technical information and we appreciate you tuning in to get that. But the questions are, how are the student generation rates applied? And I say that you went through that exercise on the slides. I would ask folks to go through those slides. APS experienced a decline in enrollment in 2020-21. How does that factor into the planning unit projections data?
So again, we did not use it in what we call the base data. So for our base information, as it was explained in one of the earlier slides, we used September 30th, 2019 enrollment. So we used those students that were in our system on September 30th, 2019, and then aged them through the APS system using various rates that are explained in the methodology piece. The most important being the cohort transition rates. But we did take into account that trend from 2019 to 2020. But unlike normal years where we would want to account for that trend as having equal weight or equal importance as trends in prior years, we decided, again in consultation with the consultant who's been assisting us with enrollment projections and does projections for other school districts, we decided to take into account that trend in the cohort transition rates, but provide that trend with a lower weight or de-emphasizing that trend. So, normally we would provide we looked at 2019 to 2020, 2018 to 2019, 2017 to 2018 trends. But for 2019 to 2020, instead of giving it what would be a perfect third, 33.33 to infinity, we gave it a 15% weight. So that was one way of acknowledging, yes, we acknowledge that decline in enrollment happened, and we want to account for it going forward, but we also want to control that impact and lessen it to some amount. So that's where the weights come in, and that's explained in the methodology as well. And that was done at all three school levels: elementary, middle, and high school.
Thank you, Robert. That is so helpful. And like you said, Robert, I hope that folks do review that methodology document. That's going to be very insightful. Lisa, I have 2 questions coming up for you. Thank you. And thank you, community members. Why are we doing a boundary adjustment for Drew and Abingdon?
Anybody who's been watching enrollment at Abingdon knows that they are over capacity significantly at this point in time, and that Drew actually has the right amount of capacity needed for the students at Abingdon. If we looked at the capacity of the 2 schools in enrollment, both schools would fit nicely within the 2 buildings, but right now we have more of those students actually at Abingdon. You may recall in 2018, we did a boundary process where at that time our data was telling us that Abingdon was going to be growing and its enrollment was going to be growing because of some of the development in the area and the trends of students at that time. And I also think the change in the options and transfer policy were all indicating that Abingdon's enrollment was going to be growing. However, at that time, they had just opened a new addition to the building and renovations, and everybody thought they really had a lot of space and it wouldn't be an issue. 2019-20 came along and all of a sudden they were full. We should have done a boundary process for them last fall. However, because of the pandemic and some of the work at reevaluating spaces within existing buildings, classroom spaces, to make sure that our capacity numbers were accurate, we didn't get the information we needed for Drew on time. We had some questions and we did not have a way to get in there while we were also trying to figure out how to open schools. So we didn't include them in the boundary process that was originally intended to be countywide, but then shifted to be just for the schools related to the moves in north of Route 50. So we should have done it last year. In this winter, when we did the options and transfers, we actually offered targeted transfers, trying to encourage some families from Abingdon to take advantage of transfers to Drew with transportation. However, we did not have enough families do that. And in making that recommendation to the board, we said if we did not get enough, we'd come back this fall and do a boundary process just between the two schools. And I will reiterate, we did 2 different proposals in 2018. As we keep looking back at those will be the areas we'll focus on in this boundary process. It may not be as many planning units as we begin to look at sort of those projections at the planning unit level and the total amount of space. I don't think they'll see something different than what we did in 2018, but we will come back, and that's where we'll focus when we come back this year.
Thank you, Lisa. That's excellent information. Given changes in enrollment in 2020-21, why is APS using the fall 2023 year projections instead of the fall 2019 10-year projections?
Well, I may call a friend Robert to help me on this. However, we're using the most current information. Yeah. We're using the 2020 for as far as it goes out, which does assume that some students may not return after going to private school this year. And really where we saw that happen was at the elementary level. When we look further out, we're using the 10-year projections. But Robert, do you want to add anything to that?
Robert, you're on mute.
Thank you. Again, it's a matter of erring on the side of being conservative in terms of only going out to 2024. And again, the further out you go, especially at the elementary level, your projection, especially at 2025, every single projected cohort at the elementary level is based on making all assumptions in terms of the incoming kindergarteners, and so again, erring on the side of being conservative.
Right, thank you. Robert, since I have you up there, I have one last question. I think it's the last question for you. I know it's on the methodology document, but can you explain the projections? This is the question. Can you explain the projections methodology for kindergarten students?
So we include that explanation on page 16 of the methodology report. Mm-hmm. But one thing that it involves, and I'm looking at the report right now to sort of prompt some of the points that I'll speak to. We did use GIS software to match 2 data points. One was number of kindergarten students, and that would be for, so let me back up. So we did match births that occurred in 2013, 2014, 2015, to planning units. And we also then looked at the number of kindergarteners, and again used that GIS software to match those kindergarten students in 2018, 2019, and 2020 to planning units. So based on this, for example, we would have had a what we call a birth to kindergarten ratio for births that occurred in 2013 to kindergarteners that enrolled in APS for 2018. Important thing to note is that those the kindergarteners that we accounted for in that process were only those who attended a neighborhood school. And so that's when we say we try to estimate for the number of students that are estimated to attend a neighborhood school, once we use enrollment information from September 30th, 2019 or prior years, what we also do is we query to look for students that attended neighborhood schools. And the methodology document will explain, some of those queries that were done. Especially, they get a little bit more complicated at the middle school level and the high school level, more so than at the elementary level. We also looked at the birth to kindergarten ratios of 2014 birth to 2019 kindergarteners that enrolled in a neighborhood elementary school. We looked at the birth to kindergarten ratio for 2015 birth to 2020 kindergarten enrollment. So we had 3 sets of birth to kindergarten ratio, each of them unique to every single planning unit, at least every single planning unit that's habitable, because we do have some planning units that don't have residential, for example. It might all be commercial, non-residential type uses. Once we had those birth to kindergarten ratios calculated, we did use weights, and so so there are different weights that were applied, and part of it was, again, just like the earlier explanation on using 2020 enrollment. Part of the rationale that we explained in the methodology document was placing a 20% weight on those trends from 2015 birth to 2020 kindergartners and giving it a 20% weight, just to acknowledge the fact that the drop in enrollment happened, but at the same time de-emphasize it somewhat. So another thing that we had to do was we have historical information, and I should back up and also give credit to Arlington County government, because they work with the Virginia Department of Health to provide APS with address level information on the number of births by address to Arlington County parents. So that's the data that we're using for that, as well as the county provides us through through the Virginia Department of Health, the official number of births that occurred historically in the county to Arlington County parents. So we looked at those official births for 2013, 24, and 2015, and the way that we had to apply those birth to kindergarten ratios. Let me see. Just a second. Let me get caught up in my reading. So another thing that we did is look at those births that occurred by planning units, but also create shares. So, for example, for any given planning unit, what percentage of births that took place in that planning unit, what's the percentage of overall births that occurred in all the planning units? So for 2013, 24, and 2015, we assigned unique. Again, these are unique to every single planning unit, the share of births that occurred at that planning unit. And we took a 3-year average. This 3-year average was weighted as well. And then the last step in the process, which is explained in the methodology document, is that in order to apply that birth to kindergarten ratio, as the name implies, you're looking at births and then how many kindergarteners we had 5 years later. But you can also do that going forward in time once you have that 3-year weighted average birth to kindergarten ratio that's unique to every planning unit. And you can do it going forward by looking at future number of births by planning unit. And so the reason why we took those historical shares of births was because we know the number of births that would impact certain future years, but we needed to assign those birth by planning unit. So let's see. So for example, we used let me just make sure I'm getting my numbers correct. And again, this is all explained in the technical document. So we looked at, for example, we looked at historical births that occurred, like 2016 births. We know that it's going to impact 2021 kindergarteners. So in that case, we used we had, from using those those shares of births, we applied those to 2016 births, which would provide us with let me make sure that I have this correct, this information correct.
And you do, because it's all written down in the methodology document. So don't worry, because you do.
Let's see. So what we do is we take that 3-year weighted average birth share, apply it to a future number of births, and then we apply that birth to kindergarten ratio to it. And so that's how we calculate the expected number of kindergartners. But again, because all the data that we use is based off of looking at students that attend neighborhood schools, that's how we make an assumption about that entering kindergarten cohort, and they will be for neighborhood schools specifically. And then we age them forward with those cohort transition rates, which are also explained in the methodology document.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you. One last question that we have for tonight is I'm going to ask Jonathan, I know, and also ask and just introduce you, Jonathan. I know you've been behind the scenes here, but always in the work. So Jonathan is our Director of Strategic Planning, and he has been graceful enough to help us out in monitoring the questions that come in. And of course, we work together and we'll be working together in the fall, well, throughout the summer, but engaging with you in the fall as we look at these boundary processes. But Jonathan, the question is, how is the planning unit data used in the boundary process?
Yeah, the planning unit data is really foundational to our work. It provides the basis in looking at the schools that are over capacity and the schools that have space for additional students. So as we kind of go look at the middle schools, look at the high schools, and Abingdon and Drew in the fall, we will be going back to the planning unit data and seeing what adjustments might be needed as we apply those boundary considerations, as we look at efficiency and proximity and stability, alignment, demographics, contiguity, and applying those boundary considerations to see what adjustments we make that will align with that policy. And the planning unit data, it not only provides the number of students, but which schools they matriculate to. So as we look to move and adjust planning units to see if what impact that would have on the students' matriculation and the cohort of students, and different demographics that we consider. So it really is foundational to the work. So this process is hugely helpful to our work in the fall when we begin to share some proposed scenarios with the community to help ensure that we're bringing enrollment to manageable levels at all our schools, and not just for the following school year, but looking 3 years out. And so the projection work that Robert and others have provided really helps us ensure that we're setting up the schools to be, at manageable levels with our adjustments that we will propose as part of the boundary process. So, very, very formative in this work.
Thank you. Thank you to you, community members, for tuning in. I just want to stress that all of this information, of course, is available online. This is really technical information, and we do provide all of the resources, the tools, the data, the methodology, document in detail so that you're able to review it. For those of you who are interested in reviewing this data for us and providing us with that review and that input, we truly appreciate it. As you can see, this is foundational to our work, and really by doing it now, it does provide us and you with the opportunity for us to have these discussions now. So we do appreciate that. And of course, as always, thank you to the team. This information will be posted. Please share it widely to those whom you know will be very interested in this information so that they can also review and provide us with that input. And with that, I'm going to say good night to my colleagues and of course, good night to you community members. Thank you.